Hi, this is David Ross, and welcome once again to the Lion's Roar podcast. Today, what I want to talk about is what I see as sort of the resurgence or the next wave of what we would call traditional, which, if you know me, may surprise you, may not surprise you. But what am I talking about? Well, sort of a related thing is the fact that we are getting the Chinese Shuijiao Association back up and running. This is the organization that Master Deng Xiaoping set up in 1971 for promoting Shuijiao in the United States, particularly his brand of Shuijiao, and it kind of fell into disuse, and in general, Shuijiao has sort of had its ups and downs, but we're working really hard because I think it's, a worthy thing to do to build it back up. And so I was having some discussions with some people that are involved, some of the instructors that are joining on, and also some people that are interested in joining and everything. And one of the things I was talking about was, the positioning of something like Shuijiao in the, the modern age. And what I said was, I think Shuijiao is uniquely positioned because I do see a resurgence of what we would call traditional martial arts. Though, one of my friends pointed this out, you have to sort of clarify that by explaining what you mean by traditional, because it's not exactly what we thought of like in the 70s and the 80s, or more like the 80s and the 90s with traditional. So, like brief history, and it is history for some people. I mean, some of us have lived through it, some of us haven't. When we think about how old the UFC is, it's 28 years old, something like that, off the top of my head. I mean, some people don't remember when it first started, but UFC showed up. People weren't sure it was real. People thought it was like a pro wrestling promotion and everything. But after the first couple of UFCs, people were quick to pronounce traditional dead. Now, back then, Hoist, who was a skinny kid in a uniform, may I add, because that's related to what we're talking about, beat all these other martial arts people, and people were starting to get interested in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, as it was at that time. And that's kind of sort of an important distinction. But they got interested in the Gracie family Jiu-Jitsu. They got interested in grappling. Now, of course, initially some people predicted that it would be all grappling and striking would die out. Traditional, as martial arts as we know it, would not look anything like the traditional that we were used to, which, especially at that point, was, kind of dominated by striking arts. However, as I've pointed out on numerous occasions, in those early years, I think it was in 1994, I got a chance to train with Rickson Gracie. And as someone who understood, obviously, the Gracie family Jiu-Jitsu very well, who knew a lot about fighting, having had a lot of fights, knew a lot about, what was Vale Tudo, and they used to call it no holds barred. Then they came up with MMA, mixed martial arts, as a more politically digestible term. But it was interesting that he said to a room full of people, it's not going to stay this way. You're going to see striking again. Had it down to, I don't even say predicted it, because he just knew. So it's interesting, people originally thought, well, it'll all be Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. It'd be like, grappling arts. And also, people don't understand this now, but at the time, if you wanted to do what we now call Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, you had to give up whatever else you were doing. It was an us versus them mentality. So people thought it was going to do that, or people thought they were going to create their own grappling methods, mixing like wrestling and judo and sambo and stuff like that. Isn't quite what happened, but certainly, for what we're talking about today, traditional martial arts had an identity crisis. People became more interested in what we would consider mixed martial arts. That included, as the striking developed, it gave Muay Thai boxing a big push in this country. People started going, well, I don't want to wear a uniform. I want to wear a belt. I mean, it also just sort of changed that idea that if you just sort of dedicated yourself to a traditional school, eventually you're going to learn secrets, and the secrets are going to let you fight. People are like, well, how am I going to learn how to fight? When am I going to learn this stuff? It just sort of changed everything, and it made people skeptical. We used to believe that, if an Asian master had a martial arts school, they must be deadly, and, let's just sign up and take lessons, whereas people became skeptical. it was an identity crisis. And of course, I think the initial wave of traditional people were very much in denial. I mean, if you were on any kind of forums, back then we had the AOL forums, tells you how long ago that was. And you saw a lot of people, like, I'll do an axe kick as they rush in to shoot. I mean, just sort of delusional and disconnected from reality. And I would say probably about a decade it took where, like, traditional people just didn't want to deal with MMA, wanted to come up with excuses. There was a lot of denial, a lot of excuses. But then there was sort of a change. And you saw a lot of people with traditional backgrounds, like me. I may stand out, but I'm not the only one that started looking at these more modern ways to train. Some people converted right over. Some people were, and I guess to a certain extent, for a period of time, I was only training fighters. People thought I converted over. I kind of saw it as part of a process going on. People also started looking at traditional, and I've also talked about this. Well, what is really traditional? Now, again, like I said, in the late 80s and the 90s, when we were talking about Chinese martial arts, when we were talking about Kung Fu, uniforms, foreign languages, lots of forms. And the selling point was forms. There's an instructor, I don't need to tell you who he was, whose big selling point was, I have 300 empty hand forms and 175 weapon forms. And people were like, wow, I want to do that, because they thought that's what traditional was. But that's not really traditional. There are systems that have a couple of forms. Wing Chun is the most famous. It has 3 forms, really. Maybe 5 if you talk about some of the mainland versions. Excuse me. Hung Ga really has between 5 and 7 forms, again, depending on how you decide to do it. Some people will say, like, for example, there's a lot of sets associated with Trolley Foot, but if you're doing like 4 or 5 of them, you can get a lot of the system, especially depending on which 4 or 5 of them you're doing. What is traditional? I've often said, well, if we go back and look at traditional, we look at something like Xingyi. Their forms are not what we think of as these big elaborate forms. A lot of times they're just lines of movement. Shuijiao, getting back to what I was first talking about, which, we were getting Shuijiao off the ground, and where I think our positioning is as a traditional art. People are somewhat interested in that again. Good lineage, respected masters. Zheng Xingping, who was the head of the college and trained military, the head of the police college and trained military people, and was a direct disciple of Chang Dongsheng. Chang Dongsheng being the national full contact champion of China, undefeated in his lifetime. Lineage inheritor of Bao Ding style of Shuijiao, these kind of things. But also, look at the forms, what we call forms in Shuijiao. These are not really elaborate things. These are like, they start off as almost singular motions, and then they became like small sets of like 3 or 4 or 5 motions. I've been critical before, but I don't want to go like specifically who I'm critical of. But there's been a movement to make Shuijiao forms looking almost like long fist forms, or looking more like other kung fu forms. I think it's the wrong thing. It's the wrong direction. The argument that they try to sell them as is that there was somehow hidden before. No, we have black and white footage of Central Wushu period people training Shuijiao, and they're doing exactly march and kick and diagonal striking and diagonal pulling and neck surrounding and stuff. The things that we saw, and we have video of Chang Dongsheng teaching. There's enough to just say what it is. Like people thought maybe that's a better way to sell it, but I don't think it is. I think in the resurgence of traditional, real Chinese martial arts, authentic Chinese martial arts, but hard training and practical. And so that's what I'm getting to. In other words, we went through this period of time where everybody wanted to get rid of anything that looked traditional, or so they thought. But then again, look at the growth of the Gracie Jiu-Jitsu and then Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu that came after it. Like I said, striking also got a big boost from MMA. But look at Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. Wearing uniforms, wearing belts, have rank, have lineages. I mean, clearly, if you're involved in anything in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you know lineages. And also a veneration of the one master, Helio Gracie. And I'm not criticizing that. I'm just pointing out that makes it similar to other traditional. He certainly merits that veneration. Very unique character, very interesting character, just like some of the interesting characters we have in Chinese martial arts. It's kind of traditional. And people do it. People were still attracted to it. Sambo, uniform, belts. To push Sambo in this country, some people made the belts actually belt ranking, started being more like a judo or a jiu-jitsu approach. It sold. You saw things like Krav Maga, which were originally just sort of army combatives, become more like traditional martial arts in order to function. And to some extent, because we're not training people in the military, we're not really running fighter schools, not if you want to be successful anyway. So we're going back and looking at traditional. And we see Chinese martial arts, at least, the new frame is what my friend had called it, the new framework. Which is interesting because it's the Chinese also old frame, new frame, Jia, Xinjia, Loujia, Laojia. Interesting frame. But martial arts can be still traditional, but, like I said, they have to still remain practical, and they still have to teach application, and no longer are we looking for systems that have hundreds of forms, especially now elaborate forms. We're looking for practical application. That's the new framework. But again, it's what's old is new again, because I would argue that if we go back and look at Shui Jiao, if we go back and look at Xingyi, if we go back and look at older Chinese martial arts, they have all this elaborate stuff. Also remember that people think they know what traditional is, but a lot of times they really stop and take a second look at it. This is going back to the last podcast I did about, who created mixed martial arts. Bruce Lee created mixed martial arts because he said you should study several styles and combine the best of them, as if that was his original idea. It's not very popular even in the Shui Jiao community to talk about the influence of judo because it's a Japanese martial art on Shui Jiao. But if we're really honest, we know it's there. And I've talked about this a lot. The other thing that isn't that really that popular in Shui Jiao, but it's there is, now again, everybody has, their own positions that they take. I tend to try to look for the truth, and so you always end up somewhere kind of in the middle and gray. There's certainly no question that there was a high degree of nationalism at the beginning of the Republican period. And so Tong Yiji's, Shui Jiao book, which was published in the Republican period, here's a Manchurian that said he studied with Mongolians, but he made sure that he titled the book Chinese Shui Jiao. There is no escaping how much influence on modern Shui Jiao there is by Mongolian and Manchurian systems. Shan Puying was Manchurians, set up in the Manchurian dynasty in the Manchurian Forbidden City as the Imperial Guard, and they mixed a lot of Mongolian wrestling in there because they were wrestling Mongolians as sort of a diplomatic function, and they wanted to be able to beat them. And so people didn't want to talk about the Manchurians, who were very unpopular, and the dynasty had just fallen. They didn't want to talk about the Mongolians, who were also a foreign dynasty, and they wanted it to be Chinese wrestling, Chinese Shui Jiao. But clearly it is. Now, some people say, that's it, and I don't agree that either, because we know that there were wrestling schools operating outside of the Shan Puying. We know that there were ethnic Chinese, Han Chinese, that were doing some kind of wrestling. And again, the problem is that wrestling is such a generic term. What are we talking about now? I agree with the argument that Shui Jiao, as we have it now, does not have one unbroken lineage going all the way back to, like, for example, Jiao Di and Jiao Li. But we have wrestling, generic use of the term wrestling, all through Chinese history, and there were influences of that Chinese wrestling on all Chinese martial arts. We can see them, and clearly that Chinese wrestling, I don't want to call it Shui Jiao and get it confusing, that Chinese wrestling tradition did not completely die out and disappear, and it had influences on whatever, in one way, shape, or form on the modern form of Shui Jiao. If we're honest, we're going to say that the Shui Jiao that we practice now comes from three influences. The Manchurians themselves, who run the Shan Puying, because almost all the schools have direct relationship to the Shan Puying and the dissolution of the Shan Puying. Then you have the Mongolians, who are just great wrestlers and obviously influenced everyone. And we know that the Shan Puying wrestlers were wrestling Mongolians. And then Chinese. And later on, remember that they weren't just bannermen in the Shampooing. They started letting in Chinese, and we know that's how, for example, we get the Baoding school, because people would go in and come out and go in and come out, and stuff would, come in from the outside, just the same way as stuff would go from the Shampooing out into the public and set up these schools. People always want to take these positions, and they always have to take like a black and white or an extreme, but the truth always is somewhere in the middle, and it's gray. Shuijiao is, I think, uniquely positioned because, like I said, we have this resurgence, this interest in traditional, because there are things that are positive in traditional that we need to preserve. And again, real, authentic, traditional Chinese martial arts were applicable, were good for your health, were good for self-defense, and by taking tradition, it gives us a certain amount of structure, which allows us to function, as opposed to the MMA. And I'm not bashing MMA either. MMA has its good points and its bad points. Traditional has its good points and its bad points. We're talking about sort of again, a hybrid, sort of like the Shuijiao that I've been just talking about, moving forward. But I think there's a resurgence in interest in things traditional. For example, 15, 20 years ago, I don't think people would have been interested in, they may have been interested in the throws of Shuijiao, but they wouldn't want to know what the names are in Chinese and the technique names, and they wouldn't have wanted to know the history. And they would want to have done it in the version that we do without the jackets, as opposed to the version that we do with the jackets. So it's like the Sanshou, the free fighting application, the Sanshou Shuifa. I think now people want to learn the jacket, the classical, which also has, definitely street application for self-defense. They want to learn the stuff without the jackets. They want to learn striking. They want to learn, which is what they wanted to do in the Central Wushu, the Central Martial Arts Academy in the 30s. It just never got completed as a job. And we should also look at them where they were open-minded and going to add in judo, because they knew for police work they needed some groundwork, and subduing techniques. And as I've said, again, maybe make me unpopular, the term we use, daibushu, is literally the Chinese reading of Chinese characters, but the term itself was from Japan, used by the Japanese police, which came out of Kano's judo. But then when they started the same program in the Central Wushu, they used that term, reading the characters in Chinese, because they were Chinese characters and they were Chinese. As dumb as that sounds. But there's a resurgence. And again, it's exactly what Hickson said in 1994 to us. People will adjust. Things that you thought weren't practical will become practical again when you learn to adjust. You just, have to ride the waves. But I think there's something to be said. And people want belts again, I think. And I think that, again, we were really skeptical for about 10 years of masters and lineages and tradition. But people were interested in that again. It's not just, it used to be, I'm David Ross, and I trained a whole bunch of fighters that, have fought all over the world and fought full rules and fought MMA and had titles. But it's also, I'm David Ross, I'm a disciple of Chan Tai-san, and, with James Chin, I learned Shuijiao, and James is the number one disciple of, the most senior, not the first one, but the most senior under Master Zhang, and Master Zhang is a senior disciple of Master Chang, and Dongsheng is a huge figure. People were interested in that, and also this idea that we're passing on a tradition. I'm not a big fan, as you know, of secrets and stuff like that. So, if that's attached to traditional in your mind, I would argue that, again, it's what you think traditional is. I would argue that a lot of things that people think are traditional are not traditional. But if, let's say, you thought traditional had secrets, well, we're not going forward with that. We're going forward with, there are techniques that have always been part of Chinese martial arts that are very effective, assuming you train them correctly. Let me say that again. There are techniques in Chinese martial arts that are extremely effective, and they should be preserved, and they should be taught. But of course, it's how you train them. I've said many, hundreds of thousands of times at this point. The thing about Chinese martial arts is sometimes the thing that is its strength is also its weakness. The way that forms were taught. I talked about Lohan Saixin the other day. That's what we call it in Chan Tai-san's Lama Pai. But in Shuijiao, it's either Kao, which is leaning, or it's Guan, which is basically what Lohansai is, where you're scissoring them and using your arm to throw them over. But when I'm doing that with two arms, one arm is extending, that's the one scissoring and throwing them over, the other hand is out behind me. And what that's really telling you is it's also towel, which is when you don't throw them by scissoring them, you reach in and grab their inner thigh and then pick them up and throw them. All those techniques are in one pose, almost, in Lamapai. You know, you go through the form and you get the Lohansai, boom. In one way, that's great. Look, you know, you have all this technique preserved in, you know, the form. But of course, we mostly know now that most people will learn the form and never learn how to actually apply those things and understand that it's could possibly be cow, could possibly be guan, it could be towel, not cow, but towel with a T. It could be other things too. It could be, you know, reaching down to do bana, you know, which is an ankle pick. It could be a lot of different things. I'm not a big fan of elaborate forms. I have sort of put together, you know, arranged some short, rearranged, artificial. Well, you know, artificial, I say that because I just tell people straight off, I created these. They're not, you know, secret, long tradition. But let's remember also that all forms were created by someone. Put together some short forms for people that were kind of interested in still doing forms, but I'm not really that fond of them. And when it comes to Shuijiao, I like the fact that the quote-unquote forms are not really forms, they're exercises. Diagonal striking, neck surrounding, diagonal pulling, elbow locking, march and kick, backward kicking. I'm not even sure you would need to do all those 6, but they're there. They're good to have some sort of standardized stuff. You know, again, I was just watching something which was like a kickboxing system started by a guy with a karate background, and so he got rid of the kata, but he sort of created kata of kickboxing combinations. So they have stuff that's like, you know, jab and then cross and then a left uppercut, then a right round kick, then you step back and stance and you jab as you're moving back. It's kind of cool, but you're kind of going back into that, you know, what Bruce Lee called the classical mess, which, you know, for me to quote Bruce Lee, you know that I'm really looking for some way to express my thought, because normally I don't quote Bruce Lee. But again, the truth is always somewhere in between, and we don't want to not have any forms, but we can always, you know, fall back into that. It's the truth versus the expedient means thing. You know, truth is that forms never work. Expedient means is you want to give them a little something, but you have to make sure that you don't fall off the edge, so to speak. I would use also the sand mandala analogy, which is that I think in that case, when they created all these little sets of kickboxing movement, they made the sand mandala, and then because it was so pretty, they left it there. It's one thing in a class to maybe run them through that sequence and then go, that's it, and we'll never see that again. Let's wipe it clean. If you don't know what I mean with a sand mandala, look it up. You understand what I'm saying? But if you then put glass over that sand mandala and don't wipe it away, then you've missed the point of the exercise of building the sand mandala. These are a little esoteric. But again, the resurgence of traditional, it's a good time if you're an open-minded person, I think. The world is our oyster. People don't know this, maybe, but, you know, like, pandemic obviously is horrible, and it's made very difficult for everybody. We know that before that we had that, you know, in 2008, 2009, you know, that the economic crash, and a lot of people also had trouble with their schools. But the irony was, back then in business groups, we talked about how during the Great Depression, some of America's richest men emerged from the Great Depression. Anytime there is something horrible like this, those that keep their wits and survive benefit from the fact that other people fall to the wayside. I know that sounds horrible, and I don't mean to sound horrible, but we're going to reemerge pretty quickly into an era where there's not as many people doing martial arts and people that want desperately to do martial arts again. And we're going to be able to fill that void. Now, again, what do I mean by traditional? Again, like I keep going back to the same thing. I would say if you ask me the traditional, remember, I always talk about the fact that I did Taekwondo in the 80s. And the Taekwondo that I did doesn't look at all like the Taekwondo I see now. I would almost say, like, I'm tempted, coming from my frame, to go, we need the traditional kind of like Kyokushin. In other words, hard workouts, hard contact, very serious. But then I've seen that some Kyokushin has also kind of been watered down. We need to do traditional, as our traditional is meant to be. Like, it's a real technique, trained correctly for real things. Real hard workouts. In the martial arts industry, not just the Chinese martial arts industry, but the martial arts industry, so many of the quote-unquote business gurus have been telling people for so many years, for decades now, water down what you're doing because people can't do it. If you make the school hard, like it was back in the day, and make people do stances and sweat, and they're going to leave, so you got to make it easy. You got to water it all down. I will quote Bedros Keuilian. You can look him up also. When he talked about look at the fitness trends. This was before the pandemic, but it holds still as true then as when he said it as now. People are interested in hardcore stuff. CrossFit, kettlebells, Indian club swinging, in diets, paleo diet. Like, hardcore stuff is all very successful and very profitable. I'm not all about money, but there's nothing wrong with making money. And certainly if you're running a school, you have to be able to make enough money to pay your bills. Otherwise, how are you going to survive? Don't be afraid to have a hard workout. Don't be afraid to show people real technique. Biggest thing. I've been saying this for decades. The franchise I once belonged to, which I will not mention, but everybody knows what it is. Its biggest problem was when I first said to them, when they first came along, I said, give them hard workouts and teach them real stuff. But the problem is that when you become like a franchise model and you have to sort of bring people in that aren't martial arts people and teach them how to run a franchise and train them, in 4 days, 5 days, with maybe 2 days of actual physical training, it's very hard to do. Stuff inevitably gets watered down. I won't speculate whether it was conscious or just sort of an inevitable evolution. But I would say, I've been training people in real technique. Even if you're not a fighter, I'm still going to teach you jab, cross, hook, and uppercut correctly. I'm still going to teach you a real stance, real footwork, real power generation. And I argue also numerous times that real power generation, if you're running a fitness program, learning how to hit a bag really hard, kick a bag knee, or do the glove drills where we punch the gloves and throw the knees and throw the kicks at each other. That's how you get people into shape. And then once they get into shape and they see results, they love you for it. We can do it with belts. We can do it with titles. We can do it with Chinese names or Asian names. If I'm talking to people that aren't kung fu people and are listening about this, we can fill a big void. I mean, I also said the other day, people say to me something like, you can post like traditional kung fu stuff, and then you post MMA the next day, and then another day you're doing meditations on the floor and talking about mobility and flexibility and balance, like physical culture kind of stuff. And I said, you shouldn't ask why I can do that. You should ask why other people cannot do that, because that's all in our traditional. Right? We have the basics, which is what most people think of as traditional. We always had the fighting. In the 70s, we didn't have discussions like this. There were plenty of people doing kung fu and fighting full contact and training really hard. It was not an issue. That was our MMA stuff. I mean, the first people doing full contact defense in the United States were kung fu people. Early kickboxing especially was a lot of kung fu people, because they came out of those kind of closed events like Paul Vizio did, and, were fighting full contact. These things, like I said, give them fitness. And the traditional stuff is really good for that sense of community, that sense of belonging. It is a supportive environment. people like coming not just because they like the workout. I mean, because you can still do a workout at home. You know, you can buy these machines, and now this thing is like a mirror and it talks to you. You know, like mirror on the wall. That would creep me out. But but people like going to work out with other people. People like being part of a community. Hey, same person I saw last week, here again. Let's do some drills together. People like partner work. And trust me when I say, you can teach people real technique. Because like I said, I've been doing it for more than 3 decades now. Regular people that are not interested in fighting, I don't have to do full contact drills, or and I don't mean full contact, I mean full drills, doing contact drills the full way. There are stages and ways to do this stuff, and people like it. I'm surviving through the pandemic doing stuff that most people would tell me I would never work. It's what I'm teaching because, we've been out in Central Park. We're not back in full-time space, and people are still signing up, and people are signing up for memberships and showing up like 3 times a week and taking classes and telling their friends and getting their friends to buy Groupons. And we're selling more Groupons than we've ever sold since the very beginning of, when we started doing Groupons, and back when there was, no martial arts on Groupon but us. People will do it. There's a resurgence of traditional. Again, if you understand traditional to be, 70s and before, and if we look at it with a hard, objective eye, I think it's a good thing. I used to be the biggest promoter of MMA in so many ways. I would bring friends over every month to watch the UFC when it was monthly. I promoted shows. I wrote rules. I think it kind of lost its way also. Again, because it became a big business, sort of like, boxing became a little corrupt also. And you see it too because the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu people, it became Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it became more like IBJJ, International Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Federation, sport rules, which started losing its connection to the original Gracie family stuff. You see, now Hickson offering stuff online so you can learn the real family way that things are done. His former student Atkins, who's doing a great program. Horian's Sons, who's teaching the real stuff to people. Again, got rid of that idea of secrets. God bless them, and I think for the better. And they're successful doing it. And again, tradition, that veneration for Elio, the art that Elio taught, including the self-defense stuff. A lot of people think of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu now, and they just think, like I said, of that International Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Federation sport stuff. The rolling around was really not that sport either, because when I was rolling around in the 90s, rolling around was rolling around. There was no striking, it wasn't a Vale Tudo fight, it wasn't self-defense, but, a lot of things were legal that are now, totally illegal. And then, of course, there's the Vale Tudo stuff, which is, like their kind of sport challenge method kind of thing. And then there was the self-defense stuff, which, we always said looked like old-style judo. And I'm not saying that all of it's great. Some of it's, a little outdated. But the idea that they want to keep that tradition going. I'm looking at certain things that were done in Shuijiao, especially back in the 30s. And, of course, guns are different now. We know things about how people really fight with knives. We have different ways that people fight knives. I said this before also, police training teaches you one thing, which is that in every culture there's a different context. Some cultures are knife cultures. You have to expect that everybody's going to be walking around with a knife. Some cultures are gun cultures. In the United States, police officers have to be very concerned about guns. We're gun culture. In Japan, it's knife culture. But the way a Yakuza with a bladed weapon is going to attack you is going to be different than, for example, here in the penal system, in the penitentiaries, getting prepared for, the shanks and the weapons that they have there. You have to learn different things. I mean, that's why, I suggested if you're going to be in the United States or in, the Western Hemisphere and you want to know about blade defense, knife defense, look at what the Dog Brothers are doing. And one of their guys is, in the penal system. as a guard. Don't misunderstand me, as a guard. This is what we're doing moving forward. And don't think that just because we're adding in traditional, we have to be so close-minded. I don't think it was ever about that. Before Chang Dongsheng, Pinyin put quote-unquote Shaolin Chuan, like long arm stuff that was native to Hebei, into his Baoting Shuijiao. Chang Dongsheng strained at the Central Wushu, so he was exposed to some striking methods. He was exposed specifically to Tai Chi, Xinyi, and Bagua, incorporated some of them. Master Zheng, we know, incorporated some, 8-step praying mantis. James Chin was a long fist student, so we used to do a lot of long fist drills. I particularly think the Lama, I know, the Lama, having come from Western China, was very influenced by Mongolian wrestling, and there's a lot of movements that, you can interpret either as striking movements or as throwing movements. And so you then go back and look at the Shuijiao and go, well, these are obviously throwing movements, but they're also striking movements. And so I think that stuff just works perfectly. And, as we brought Steve Ventura into the fold, who's my classmate under Chantai-san and a Lama Pai instructor, who has all that Shuijiao training that we got from Chantai-san, Mongolian Shuijiao training. But we've known this because, I've been with Steve running schools for 30 years, like I said, off and on in different ways. And we even did articles back in the 90s. You can look at some of the articles. We compared the Lama movements and the Shuijiao, the Baoting Shuijiao movements. The same movements. Except sometimes we thought instead of elbow locking it was an uppercut. Instead of neck surrounding, we thought of it as a hook punch. But the Shuijiao people knew that it was both of those things also. And the Lama Pai people knew also that it was also throwing, because we learned all those throws. The same throws I was doing with James, and Master Chang in the Baoting lineage, we were doing in Lama with different names because, different traditions. And, maybe somewhat different because, we were not doing it with jacket wrestling. But again, in Shuijiao, we have technique specifically. If you look at the Taiwan Police College material, for example, it says you can grab the jacket. If you don't have a jacket, this is how you grab. I mean, every little paragraph has those two. This is the grab for the upper collar. If you don't have that, you grab the neck. This is the grab, for the collar. If you don't have that, reach up and grab the shoulder, or arm drag. This is how you don't have a belt, grab the waist, the love handles, as we would say. It's a good time, and it's exciting. For myself personally, I just need to reopen again full time so I can then start filming all this stuff. I want to make sure that we film everything because I also want to make sure that we're doing a lot of instructor training. We have to prepare people for this new generation. Teach people how to teach. If one thing is definitely missing in martial arts, and particularly in Chinese martial arts, it's teaching people how to teach. Knowing how to present material. Knowing how to arrange material. Knowing when you take the student to the next level. Knowing how even you run a class. I mean, stuff that you would see in basic coaching books. I've said before, I have books that have nothing to do with martial arts. They're just pure coaching things. It would be the same if you were like in a high school track coach or, a high school basketball coach. But these truths are universal. People will work best if they're grouped with similar level people. So you put the advanced people off kind of, you can have a mixed class, but you have the advanced people sort of working together in a corner, and sort of the intermediate people in the middle, and then you let the beginners people be in the other corner, and you don't want them right next to each other because they kind of intimidate each other. How do you arrange a skill? Well, you present a skill in pieces, right? This is coaching 101. And I want to do this for everything that we do. And in the Chinese Shuijiao Association, we're getting the website up. We had a small problem, but it's coming up. We're using Teachable connected to it for stuff, but definitely in Teachable, if you're an instructor, we're going to show you how to present hip throw, one, or hip bie, or, twi, any one of these things. We're going to break it down. This is exactly how you run a class. I mean, we literally just did your first 10 weeks, 2 times a week, 20 classes, from the time they walk in to that, 20th class. Exactly what they're doing each day that they're there, in the order that they're doing it. people need this, I think. And, like I said, we're going to step into a unique niche that has been created by this horrible pandemic, where as we reopen, people need to get healthy. They're tired of being locked away. And let's offer them exactly what they need. Health, self-defense, confidence. As always, this is David Ross. Thank you so much for tuning in. This is The Lion's Roar.